Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for coming today. I think the fact that there's so many of you here for a lunchtime seminar obviously testifies to the quality of our speakers, but also to the level of worry that I think we might all harbor around these issues concerning populist mobilization, far-right mobilization, its impact on political life, political institutions, public opinion, and also obviously the European issue and the institutions of the European Union, keeping in mind that in roughly a year from now there will be European elections, and that these elections, I must say, concern some of us, certainly concern me in terms of the kinds of representation that they might return with a strong showing on the part of populist parties right across, no pun intended, but right across Europe. So we're here to discuss this in context, and we're here to do this in two ways. First of all, let me tell you just a tiny bit about the project of which this publication by Michel Vieviorka, which we are launching today, is a part. The project is called Recapturing Europe's Reluctant Radicals, and it's essentially looking at the kinds of voters who might be tempted to vote for right-wing populist parties and sometimes extreme right-wing populist parties, understanding them, understanding what their outlooks might be, understanding who they are. And we came out with a pamphlet in the autumn by myself and my two co-authors at Counterpoint that gives you an idea of who these people are right across Europe, and certainly sheds, we think, some critical light on exactly who might be tempted to vote for these parties. But the project in and of itself is also concerned really about drawing out the specificities of these votes in these various European countries. Because one of the things that's quite interesting for us is the fact that there are a number of almost generic headlines that seem to mobilize these voters, whether it's anti-EU as a form of anti-elitism and anti-establishment, and also immigration in many parts of Europe. This is a hard issue that the populist right plays with and scores with very, very often. But aside from this sort of slightly generic sense of what might appeal to these voters, what is interesting and very important to understand is actually how these voters differ from one another in different places, because this is how it is. This is the only way that actually they can be countered. They need to be listened to in their specificity, but also if it's a question of bringing some of these people back into the mainstream. And our study shows that because they're uncommitted voters, for the majority, because they're volatile voters, there's a sense in which they can be brought back in to vote for mainstream parties, to support mainstream institutions. But in order to do that, there needs to be a real understanding of what makes them tick in context. The cultural and social springs that actually define every kind of populist mobilization in different places. So the myths, the narratives, the cultural specificity, the symbols, the dirty little secrets, the different types of prides, and the different reference points that people actually refer to and react to, and which mobilizes them. So what we've done is, aside from our study, is produce a series of writings by various authors, one for each of the countries that we're interested in, and these authors are all extremely apt in different ways of giving a really in-depth, how can I put this, a really in-depth, a really cogent kind of interpretation of the context in which these parties take root. Today, we have the pleasure of launching Michel Vieviorka's pamphlet, which focuses on France, which focuses on the French context. And so this is how we will begin our session. Let me just very briefly introduce my speakers. To my right is Michel Vieviorca, who is one of France's most eminent sociologists. He's a specialist and has written extensively with great expertise on racism, on violence, on diversity. He is currently the director of the Fondation pour la Maison des Sciences de l'Homme, and it's been a great pleasure to work with him, and he's produced a wonderful pamphlet on essentially the terrain in which the Front National in France takes root, how it's changed over the years, also how it's not changed over the years, but also how its voters have changed over the years, which I think is really important. To my left, I have Peter Kellner. Peter Kellner, who's the president of YouGov, but also who is one of the UK's leading political commentators, and I'm counting on him to give us some insights as to the exceptionalism and the nature of the populist appeal here in the UK, and in particular perhaps a view on the UKIP phenomenon and on the UKIP vote that we saw last week. To his left is Professor Othon Anastasakis, who's the director of CSOX. For those of you who haven't got the lingo, CSOX is Southeast European Studies at Oxford University. And Othon, I know that you've written extensively, not just on comparative politics, but also on the far right and on Greek politics. And so we're counting on you to essentially shed some light on the Greek phenomenon, which I sometimes hesitate to qualify as populist because it seems just quite plainly extremist. But I wait to hear from you. And then all the way to my right, in keeping with the theme of this of today's talk, is Professor Philippe Marière, who is professor of French and European politics here at UCL, and who's a specialist on the Socialist Party, but also has written extensively on the Sarkozy government, and who will also contribute to our discussion on France. I'm Catherine Fieschi. I'm director of Counterpoint, but I'm going to hand over to Michel.
Thank you, Catherine, and it's my pleasure to, first of all, thank you really sincerely, and to thank also Lila, because when you live in France and you have to deal with Counterpoint, you have to have good relations with Lila also. So I would like to say I am not an expert or a very great specialist of the National Front, the Front National. So when Catherine asked me to write something, I decided that I will do it, and I have some good reasons that make possible for me to propose something which is not exactly what you can read in the so many books and articles that have been written on this point. There is a huge literature on the National Front, surveys, polls. You also have at least, I know, at least 2 important journalist pieces by journalists that have made what we could call, if we were anthropologists, participating observation. This is to say, go without saying that you are a journalist to the National Front local people and say, I would like to belong to your group and to live with you and so on. There is a lot to say about this kind of the methodology. It's not mine, but so there is a huge literature. So what I brought is something a little bit different maybe, because on the one hand, I decided to read not only literature, but also newspapers, daily newspapers or weekly newspapers, local ones, not the national ones. But you know, if you want to read the Télégramme de Brest or Le Progrès de Lyon, when they say something about local events connected with the National Front, you learn a lot. You learn a lot. It's very useful. And this was my way to get in this issue. And maybe two other points that made me able to write something. I have been making research on racism in France, and I met many people, I did not meet them as National Front voters, but I met them and I understood that they were National Front voters, and so I learned a lot with my fieldwork in the past. And my last point, I have a house near Avignon, between exactly Carpentras and Cavaillon. That is to say, 2 main small cities where the National Front is making, I don't know, 35 or 40% of votes. And in my village, 1% out of 3 votes National Front, more or less. So when you are in the street of the village, you know everybody knows everybody. You know that 1% out of 3 is a voter for this party. So it gives you also some knowledge, let us say, empirical, concrete knowledge. So what I try to do is, first of all, to demonstrate that there have been 3 stages in the history of the National Front, the French National Front. The first stage, you can call it prehistoric. It's between 1972, from my point of view, and 1983. 1972, nobody knows, but it is the end of what the French called les 30 Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years after the Second World War. And it's 1972, it's no problem with employment, growth. People believe in science. There is a strong communist party. I mean, France is totally different of what it started to become after 73 or 74. So in 72, a certain number of groups, in French we say groupuscules, I don't know if I can say it in English, very small groups of extreme right people, and when you have several groups of extreme right, they have good reason to consider that they are very, very different, one in front of each other. So a certain number of this groupuscule, very small group, decided to create something new altogether, which was called le Front National. And at the very beginning, it was not sure that Jean-Marie Le Pen would become the leader. But very quickly, he managed to become the leader of this melting of a certain number of small groups, which was almost nothing. It was the French extreme right. But really nothing in the general political debate. And between 1972 and 1983, these people, some of them had nostalgia for Pétain, others had nostalgia for Charles Maurras, others had nostalgia for the Reich. One of them was a member of the French division of the SS troops. And so, but they did not do so much. Then in 1983, for the first time, we had local elections in the city, Dreux, not far from Paris, beginning of Normandy. And in this city, for the first time, the National Front appeared as a political force, not as a small group. And it was the beginning. So the real birth of the National Front, what you could call the first National Front, is 1983. And everybody who knows the story or the history of the National Front will say more or less what I'm telling you. So what was very important here? First of all, these people could very quickly be connected with a new ideology. And this new ideology was provided by a kind of think tanks. People used to say that France, that we don't have think tanks. We had an extreme right think tanks, the Club de l'Horloge, the New Right, and these people started to develop what has been known in this country, in England, what has been known as the new racism. That is to say, the problem is not physical differences and inferiority, the problem is cultural difference. These people, the migrants, will never be able to adapt themselves to the French values. It's cultural. So the ideology which these people started to develop or was connected with what the Club de l'Horloge and these people used to say. So that's the first, I don't remember it. Barber wrote in England about the new racism. I don't remember his name exactly. So this kind of analysis was also used in France by these people. Then, this first National Front had a certain number of characteristics. First of all, and this made him strong, they discovered migrants. Before, they did not think so much about migrants. The man who died rather soon in this prehistoric times of the National Front, who found the idea to say the problem are the migrants, was called Duprat. Nobody remembers his name. And so, but this made the National Front very strong, because suddenly there was something to say to all these people that were living in a country where we did not have full employment, when we were beginning to have the crisis in the suburbs, the violence, delinquency, and I don't have time to develop all these problems that we call in France les problèmes des banlieues, suburbs issues, riots, and so on. So, and so, speaking of migrants was a great invention, politically. So this was the first thing. Then these people were not workers. I mean, a certain number of workers could vote for the National Front. But there were most of them were people belonging to very different sectors of the society, of course, but including small shopkeepers. Maybe you know that Jean-Marie Le Pen in the 50s had been a member of parliament elected on Poujade list, which we call Poujadism. This is a movement of people that were small shopkeepers saying that they don't want to pay taxes and this kind of issue, very strong in the 50s. So there was something still like that. These people were strongly anti-communist. Communism was at that time still important in their political discourse. These people were strongly anti-Semitic. I remember a poll which has been made at one of the first meetings of the National Front in Cannes, maybe in 19, I don't know, maybe 86 or 87, and they were asked some questions about Jews. It was terrible. It was really terrible. So strongly anti-Semitic. They were criticizing the state. There is too much state. We pay too much taxes. And you could vote for the National Front in situations where there is no migrant. For instance, in the countryside in Alsace, there is a lot of people that used to vote for the National Front. You don't have any migrants, but the image of the migrants was strong. And I have no time to develop this, but the role of TV and the media was very important in the first, in the story, in the general story of this National Front. So this is more or less the first model, the National Front number one, if you want, with a leader, Jean-Marie Le Pen, and with moments when it was rather high and moments when it was not so high. Maybe the highest moment in the life of this first National Front was 2002, because we had at that time national presidential elections, and most of the people in France were very surprised when at the first turn, Jacques Chirac was first, but it was not Lionel Jospin, the socialist candidate, that was second. It was Jean-Marie Le Pen. It was a very strong shock for many people, including young people that understood that if they had voted Jospin and not the extreme left or ecological party or whatever, maybe it would not have been like that. But suddenly he appeared as number two. And if you take the number of his votes, and if you add the number of the votes that were gained by a man, Maigret, who had left this party split at that time, you have the highest electoral score that you can imagine. So it was the top. But then after that, during the years that followed, it was not so high. And so it is a movement that always existed, but with a peak in 2002 and not as high moments then. Then 2011 begins for me the second National Front. Why? Because Marine Le Pen was elected president of this party. The father does not disappear totally. He's still there. He is président d'honneur, honorary president. And he's still present, but he's no longer the boss. She is the boss. And she was elected through a primary election, like in the Socialist Party more recently. I mean, she was really elected by her party. So she has a strong legitimacy. What is very interesting are 2 points. The first point is that the discourse changed totally, and when the discourse changed totally, it means that something is new also from the point of view of the people, of the voters. It's not exactly the same voters. So what changed? What did not change, first of all, I say totally, no, partially. What did not change was the anti-migrants discourse. Always very central, very strong. Something which was stronger and stronger with Le Pen further, but much more with the new one, Islam, religion. Islam became a key problem seen from the perspective of the National Front. Strongly anti-Islam, this is it. What has changed also is the discourse towards the state. Today, Marine Le Pen does not say that there should be less state and that the French state is awful. No, because she wants to get votes from the civil servants, from the people that belong to the state. And as you know, France is a country with a huge number of civil servants. So the discourse towards the state changed. But this is not the more important. The more important is that she started to speak in name of, and I use her vocabulary, that she discovered reading some sociological works or some serious articles in the newspaper. She said, I speak in name of les oubliés, the forgotten people, and les invisibles, the non-visible people. And who are these oubliés and invisibles? These people, most of them, you can consider them as workers. So she started to speak with a strong social accent, which was totally different than the previous discourse. And who are these workers she's speaking, on behalf of whom she's speaking? Not all of them, of course, but a great number of them don't live in the city, don't live in the suburbs. Most of them live in what the French specialists call peri-urban areas. I don't know if this is correct English. You understand what I mean? You see what I mean? You see what I mean? Peri-urban. That is to say, 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers, sometimes 30 or 40 kilometers out of everything. So, let me give you a caricature or an example of these people, and you will understand this word. You are a worker. You were living in the suburbs with all these migrants, awful people. You were fed up of living in this neighborhood with your wife and children. So, as you work and as she works, you could afford buying a small house, which is the dream of many people in France. You could afford buying your small house, but of course not in the city, even not in the suburbs, out of the city, in what we call lotissement, is a French expression, a set of 20 or 30 or 50 houses, all the same, you know, a kind of small ghetto for a very low middle class or popular works. So you will pay during 10 years or during 20 years to reimburse your house. It's very difficult. Then you have to have 2 cars. One for you as a worker to go to your factory, and for your wife with maybe, I don't know, cashier in a supermarket or something like that. So you need a car because there is no public transportation, there is nothing where you are. Then your children, you must bring them to school. It's always a problem. Then there is no shop, no medical service, there is nothing. So life is very difficult. And you are thinking, life is very difficult for me. I have to pay a lot and so on, to make a lot of sacrifice. And those people that stay in the suburbs, those migrants, they drive a Mercedes, they are trafficking drugs, they live in social housing, they don't pay so much, and when the children destroy the building or whatever, immediately the local power will pay so that things are repaired, and it's a shame. Yeah. This is the way these people, and so just imagine when somebody tells you, I will speak in name of les oubliés and les invisibles. This is for those people to understand perfectly that what she said is describing their own situation. So you have a lot of people like that. And to be a little bit more general, it is clear that the suburbs that in the past could vote could vote with a great number of voters for the National Front have voted less for the National Front during the very last elections, because the people that vote for the National Front are going out. So, what is also more and more important in the National Front discourse is the anti-European discourse. They are strongly, and they don't like Euro. They could be British. They don't like Europe. They don't like Euro. And they are in favor of what Pascal Perrineau called la société fermée, a closed society. They are still very nationalist. And it will be maybe my last point before my conclusion. And what is very new and very important is that this political party, which was in its prehistoric time extremist only, then which became a mixture of what some people call extremist and other people will say populist, or other people will say national populist, anti-system, anti-political parties, and so on. I don't want to have we can have it after a discussion about the concept of the notion of populism. But so they try now, and this is very new and very important, they try now to get in the system. And if you want to get in the system, you must be respectable. You must end with what they call themselves diabolisation, being considered as devil. You must end with this. And the problem of the National Front is that they were strong, when it was the father, because of sulfurous proposals, anti-Semitic jokes, very anti-systemic proposals, and so on. But if you speak like that, you cannot appear as a serious candidate in order to rule the country, or a city, or a department, or whatever. So the problem of the National Front is that they try to be less and less identified to devil, but if they are no longer identified to devil, then they lose what made them special. So it's really, for me, what is the more interesting. I give you one or two images of that. For instance, Marine Le Pen would like not to appear as anti-Semitic. She went to the United States and she tried to discuss with the Israeli ambassador. She wanted then to go to Israel. She wants to talk with some Jewish leaders, and she finds some people in the Jewish community who are extreme right oriented, and she talks with them. So she tries not to appear as anti-Semitic. But in January 2012, she went to Vienna, Austria, and she danced with, there was a big ball with the Austrian extreme right, Nazi or whatever. So the father is still there, and when she's trying to appear as open-minded and not devil and so on, there is always a good joke from the father that makes you remember something different. So this kind of thing. There is also something very interesting, and I will finish with this before I give you my political conclusion. There is also something interesting. She tries to use universal categories in order to present herself. That is to say, she does not say always, I am the nation, I don't like migrants, I don't like foreigners, and so on. And so on. No, she does not say that. She said, I am the best protection for universal values. And in France, universal values are strongly connected with the idea of république or with the idea of laïcité. I don't have time to be more precise, but just have this image. So what did she do? I just give you two examples. First of all, she said, in name of laïcité, I am against all that things that happen with Muslim people, the headscarf at school, or these people that pray in the streets, and this kind of thing. And in name of universal values, I cannot admit a religion that treats women so badly. So the extreme right, heritage, which is machist, and so now it's finished. And she's fighting in name of women against Islam. But she doesn't say, I don't like Islam. She says, I am in favor of women. And my second example is maybe more interesting. During her last campaign, the presidential campaign, Marine Le Pen once stated that if you live in Paris or near Paris, you have no choice. You must eat only, you can eat only halal meat. 99% of the meat that you can buy is halal. So it was a big scandal. Then a local leader of the National Front, who was a grocer selling this kind of meat, said, no, it's not true, it's only a small percentage, and he was obliged to leave the National Front. But she did, no, she said that, she did not say that she was mistaken, and she said there are two reasons not to accept this. So you could imagine that he would say, it's Islam is dominating our culture. No, not at all. She said, I say that in name of universal values, for two reasons. First one, I don't want this meat because animals are killed with cruelty. So in name of refusing cruelty, I don't accept this. And the second reason not to accept it was this meat is not clean. I mean, health and security and so on are not respected. So for health and sanitary reasons, this is not acceptable. That is to say, she used universal values, things that everybody should accept, in order to attack what she really wanted to attack, which was Islam. But she did not say, I hate Islam, I hate Muslims, I don't want migrants. No. So these are the main changes, and it works. So it works. She made a good score at the last elections, and we are now in France at a moment when we are going to have other elections. We shall have local elections within less than 1 year, and the big problem will be, from my point of view, the capacity of the National Front to attract or to meet or to converge with a great part of the classical right. If you listened to the French political discourse of Nicolas Sarkozy and the classical right during the last three or 4 years, there were a certain number of elements that indicate that he was looking to his right, to this extreme right. So if you have, on the one hand, a national front which is more and more respectable, and on the other hand, a classical right which is less and less respectable, to say it like that, you can imagine local and maybe more than local convergence. So this is my political conclusion. For me, the great issue is, shall we have in France a new political system with a mixture of this national front, you can call it extreme populist and so on, but this new national front converging with some elements of the classical right, and this would be, from my point of view, terrible, but it is very possible, and the next local election could be election when you would have local agreements without a big ideological political statement that we are going to do this together. No, local meetings and agreements that are not necessarily explained. So this could be the first step towards a very pessimistic scenario. So this is what I tried to explain in this pamphlet. Thank you. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. And it's interesting that a couple of weeks ago when we were in Paris and we had this discussion at Célipo, at Sciences Po, it was interesting that people were taking bets as to how long it would take Marine Le Pen to change the name of the party the minute her father died. And a lot of people were saying the minute Le Pen snuffs it, this thing is going from being the Front National to the Mouvement Bleu Marine. And that is going to be a real signal, a real transformation, further transformation down that respectability road. The bookies are taking bets on this sort of thing. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask my three speakers to respond to this from the strength of their own experience for 5 minutes. I ask you to do 5 minutes because I'd really like to open it to the audience, and you can get your other points in as people ask questions. I'm going to turn first of all to my left to you, Peter, and you, Alpon, to put this to draw a direct comparison with Greece and with the UK, because they are so fundamentally different. I'll start all the way to my left and then move to you, Peter. Is that okay?
Okay. Your extreme left.
Yes, my extreme left, not the extreme right, exactly.
Yes, let me make some points then that connect to what Michel said about France, it's what we are trying to think whether what we're seeing in Greece right now, the Golden Dawn actually, which is very, very clearly a party of the extreme right, whether it is a symptom of the crisis, of the depth of the crisis, or whether it is some kind of a disease that actually will be there for a long time. And I'm saying this because when we're studying the extreme right, we are mostly dealing with countries in Western Europe, and it's noticeable to say that Southern Europe, and especially Portugal, Spain, and Greece, the political family actually didn't have any relatives in the south, apart from Italy, which is a special case. And that has to do historically because there were dictatorships in Spain and Portugal. So in a way, that extremism was absorbed in the dictatorships. Or in the case of Greece, there was a very severe Nazi occupation, and there wasn't any kind of nostalgia towards any kind of Nazi past that we've seen in countries of the West. And also there is this kind of bitter feeling towards what happened during the war. Then there was also the dictatorship and the fact that the right-wing politics were very exclusionary in Greece after the Second World War, which actually really marginalized extreme right-wing parties which did not exist. But the phenomenon, I mean, whatever there was after the end of the military dictatorship was mostly some very small groupuscules, you call them, which had to do with some nostalgia towards the military dictatorship, but completely insignificant in the political system of Greece. What we're seeing in the post-Cold War context, this is where things may be starting to change, is not actually political parties developing, but more the kind of the ideas, the ideology that may be sustaining these kinds of parties. And because we want to connect this discussion also to a more political, cultural context, Greece started changing as a country. First of all, because there was a very big influx of immigrants that came from Eastern Europe, especially from Albania. By 2000, there were almost 600,000 Albanians actually that were working in Greece, legally or illegally. So there was actually some kind of a transformation in how Greeks started to look at their own identity in terms of, and multiculturalism. And that, because up to then Greece was a rather, homogeneous kind of country in terms of the orthodoxy, in terms of, the Greekness. And in that sense, that was actually something that started those identity questions. So that allowed actually for a party in the 2000s, Laos, to develop the most kind of anti-immigrant posture, but it was never an extreme right-wing party. I mean, many analysts I know have tried to put Laos as an extreme right-wing party, the Greek version of it, but it wasn't exactly that. It was just the most openly anti-immigrant. But in any case, what I need to point out here is that there were some kind of implicit racist discourse, which was more widespread actually, towards all the immigrants that were kind of taking the cheaper jobs, the cheaper salaries, and there was more or less an anti-Albanian kind of discourse as well. So that is kind of at the popular cultural level, and it did exist in a very kind of implicit and tacit way. But no political party as such. So what we're seeing here, just to give you an example, if we go to Golden Dawn, which was created as a party in the 1990s, the percentages that they've got in the 1996 elections was 0.1. And in 2009 elections, they got 0.3. So it's been a meteoric rise, and it has to do actually with the impact of the crisis and how strong and powerful that crisis has been in the rise of unemployment, in actually the massive rise in the young generation, especially, which I'm sure you know that it's reaching almost 60% at the moment. And yesterday's actually more general numbers are 27% overall unemployment in Greece. So, and it's also a very, very clear extreme right-wing party, because it's got all the characteristics of an extreme right-wing formation. It does scapegoating. I think that is very particularly significant in extreme right-wing parties, in that they often choose the enemy. And scapegoating, it's against the immigrants in Greece because of a context of migration that took place after 1989, that it was actually an unregulated influx of immigrants in Greece, and that allows for this kind of discourse to develop. Then they are very nationalistic. And what is interesting is that they are infiltrating the state in Greece gradually. They are creating their own parastate organizations. Not only are they infiltrating in the church or the police or the military, but are also creating their own kind of groups that deal with people that are afraid of immigrants. There is some sort of a humanitarian assistance also towards those people that either are afraid of immigrants or they are the victims of the economic crisis. Then there is a neo-Nazi kind of reference as well, in the way that they salute, in the references that they make. They are openly racist and openly exclusionary. So that actually is something which is very, very characteristic of an extreme party, extreme right-wing party. And I'm saying this because there's a lot of debate in Greece as to what are the similarities between extremism in general. Because the discourse of new democracy, actually, in its effort to be able to keep its own electorate and its own votes, actually, and remain as a government, is to present this whole situation as an extremist phenomenon. And that there are no major difference between the extreme right and the extreme left. That allows New Democracy to present Syriza, which is the main alternative now in power, to present it as being infiltrated by extremism from the left, and also to try and keep the links with the extreme right, because many of the voters from New Democracy actually do go to the Golden Dawn. So in that sense, it has this kind of discourse, which is not exactly condemning the extreme right, and presents extremism in the left as well. And so that's why I'm trying to say here that there are significant differences between what we see as extreme right and as extreme left in Greece, which is more of an anti-state kind of situation. It's rather anarchic, it's also reactionary, and it's anti-statist. Whether the extreme right is not anti-statist, it tries to infiltrate within the state. And may I just finish with some issues that I think are particularly important, which are not being widely discussed, but which present actually areas I think that could be of interest for research. First, there is the issue of funding of the Golden Dawn. I mean, this is actually a big mystery. I mean, because it is a party now that is a 7% in the parliament, it gets the funding that as a party in the parliament, but there are always in the background talks of this party being funded by big businesses, and why this is supported. I think this is an interesting question. Then the issue of toleration that exists, because it's not just the voters that actually sustain this party, it's also that there is this degree of toleration. And that's why I'm a bit hesitant to use the notion of mainstream as opposed to extremism. For me, it's more clear to say to deal with the moderation as opposed to extremism, because that allows you to deal with degrees of moderation, and then you can also understand the movement of those who are moderates, and then they become extremists at some point and due to particular circumstances. So there is a degree of toleration because of that mixture of extremism that I've been talking about between right and left. So many in the right wing of politics in Greece are actually tolerant towards the extreme right, exactly because they compare this with the existence of extreme left and the violence also that extreme leftists have been engaged with. Then another point that I think is very, very interesting actually has to do with how media is dealing with the extreme right. Not just because they give them, in Greece, not just because they give them wide publicity actually, but also because there's a lack of investigative journalism in order to be able to understand what kind of phenomenon we're dealing with. But the most significant issue, I think, and which is very important, is how Golden Dawn is managing to infiltrate state institutions. And how it is creating its own kind of committees with either a humanitarian face. You may have heard of the latest incident that had to do with them wanting to give food handouts to only those that have a Greek passport, that are Greeks. And then the mayor of Athens had to intervene and forbid them to use the Constitution Square, Syntagma Square, to do this kind. So there was a clash between the mayor and Golden Dawn. And the first time that an institution actually was able to come out so forcefully against the Golden Dawn. And of course, all the parties had to go behind the mayor and support him. I'll stop at that. And
we can cover it in the questions. Absolutely. Thank you. I'm going to then hand over to you, because we're moving to a very different sort of formation.
Let me start with some good news. Let me cheer you up. The standard bearer for the nearest we have to the Front National or Golden Dawn is the BNP, the British National Party. They're dead. Virtually disappeared. They won 6% in the European Parliament elections in 2009 and got 2 seats in the European Parliament. There were various local elections some years ago in different parts of Britain where they won a number of seats in a couple of places. I think became the main local opposition party on the council. They have lost virtually all their council seats. They will lose their 2 Euro seats next year. Now the less good news, which is that the slightly less extreme face of nationalism, UKIP, is on the rise. In the European Parliament elections in 1999, they came 4th. In 2004, they came 3rd. In 2009, they came 2nd. So the more numerically minded amongst you may detect a pattern. And I think they will come 1st next year, possibly 1st by quite a wide margin. My very, very rough guess is if the European elections are being held now, in the wake of what happened in last week's local elections and what we see in the opinion polls and the general way people tend to vote differently in European elections, I think UKIP would at the moment get 30% or more of European elections. Labour would come second with something like 25%. The Conservatives would be below 20%. So you're looking at possibly getting on for a 2-to-1 UKIP over Conservative votes in the European elections. Where's it coming from? More from the Tories than anywhere else, but from all over the place. It's not principally actually about Europe. I won't bore you with detailed numbers, but just what poll we did this week, it's a question we often ask, is we ask people what they think the most important issues face in Britain, and then given the same list, what are the most important issues facing you and your family. We give people now a list of 13 topics. We ask them to choose up to 3. Europe, amongst UKIP voters, less than half mention Europe as one of the 3 most important issues facing Britain, 45%. When you ask which is the most important issues facing you and your family, amongst UKIP voters, down to 29%, under a third. Now, yeah, higher numbers amongst UKIP than amongst Tories, let alone Labour or the Liberal Democrats, but the economy and immigration are the big drivers. I think we're dealing, as I think both people talk about a cultural phenomenon. This is a cultural phenomenon. Remember those those films some years ago, Back to the Future series. Well, UKIP is forward to the past. It's offering a rose-tinted nostalgia for Britain as people think it used to be. 40, 50, 60 years ago, when it was a white country in full employment and policemen cuffed teenagers around the ear and told them to go home and don't be silly. Now, actually, Britain 40, 50 years ago was a much nastier place than it is now. But there is a sort of distorted memory. And attitudes to Europe and immigration are symptoms of that, because they think that it's the outside world that's encroaching and destroying what they think Britain is all about. So if I was going to argue against someone who's going to deal with these cultural issues, and my broad view, which is perhaps fairly bleak one, because it's a very long and difficult thing, is that actually our political discourse has to grow up. Our political discourse, the parties have played their role, the spin doctors have played their role, the media has played its role. Our political discussion is infantilized. And therefore, if you have a party which is essentially an infantilist concept, then it will get a hearing. If we had a more grown-up political discourse, I think it would be harder for that sort of infantilism to make progress. So let me finish with one more specific observation, where Britain, well, it's sort of half like and half unlike France and Greece. My recollection, Michel, if I'm wrong, is that the Front National reached critical mass when Mitterrand cynically changed the electoral system for electing the French National Assembly. And he went from the system they had and now got back again, which is, as it were, first past the second post, when they won nothing, through in order cynically to prevent the Socialist Party from being wiped out in, I think it was the 1986 elections, changed to a proportional system, and the Front National got, whatever it was, 10, 11% of the vote, and suddenly got, was it 20 or 30 members of the National Assembly. And of course, once you're in that place, even though the system subsequently changed back, that you couldn't put the genie back in the bottle. And, 7% in Greece under the proportional system, or 7% under a majoritarian system, first past the post, first past the second post, they would have been a flash in the pan, probably already on the way out. So there is an issue to do with, voting systems. The way UKIP will, of course, have those extra Euro MPs next time. They will have all the money that goes with that. But the year after, I think they will not win a single seat in the British general election. Their vote will go down, and it will be fought under a system which will punish them. But, again, perhaps, and this is, I suppose, the nightmare, is that if they do come top next year, and the Conservative Party goes into meltdown in reaction to that, then UKIP might gain the credibility to build up a critical mass. You might get some Tory MPs defecting to UKIP and defending their seats as UKIP, where they would have a reasonable chance of holding on to those seats. You might get one or two by-elections that UKIP win and then go on to hold. In other words, you might get a real realignment on the right. Now, for those of us on the left, there's actually something oddly comforting about that, because it would mean under first past the post, divided right-wing politics makes it easier for the left to win a majority in Parliament. However, as a citizen, I think it's a very, very heavy price to pay for that electoral bonus for progressive politics. So I have to say, and recently I was invited to join the Council of the Electoral Reform Society, and I said, actually no, because although I like you as people and you do very interesting stuff, I actually don't agree with you. And I think if we'd all had majoritarian voting systems nationally and Europe, it would be a lot easier to deal with this phenomenon than it is at the moment.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter. What's interesting, actually, also, one of the questions that comes up again and again when you talk about this across countries is obviously the nature of the voting system. And what's interesting as well is if you put that together with who actually the voters are, say, for example, in France, that yes, in some ways you kind of change you block the name of the right, and you might get a some votes in terms of progressive politics. But on the other hand, actually the springs of progressive politics have changed so much that there's actually no real guarantee, given where some of these voters who are supporting these parties are moving. So, you're right to bring that forward. Philippe, I'm going to give you the last 5 minutes, because I see you have tons of notes, but you've got 5 minutes.
It's a bit shorter than that, yes. Thank you, Catherine. Don't worry about it. Let me make a few opening remarks about the notion of populism and in fact about its meteoric rise. I think it's when I did my PhD some 20 years ago, when researchers were doing a PhD dissertation, were writing a PhD dissertation about populism. It would be essentially about Latin America, and also with a case study being Argentina and the Perón government administration. So I think that it's a word which is used very commonly in the media, in political science as well. I think that it is very probably a very useful concept to describe the politics and the policies of some parties in Europe. I think it is very well suited to describe what UKIP is all about. When it comes to other parties on the right or far right, such as the National Front, the Front National in France, I think this is probably more problematic. Another point I'd like to make is that who are the populists in Europe today? I think they come from very, very various political backgrounds indeed. Nigel Farage and UKIP are deemed populist, but also Geert Wilders in the Netherlands is also populist. Beppe Grillo in Italy is a populist. The Jobbik's anti-Semitic party in Hungary is also deemed populist, but also on the left, Die Linke in Germany is often described as populist. So is Marine Le Pen, and so is Jean-Luc Mélenchon for the left front. So you see there's a bit of a problem there with having sort of forces and politicians who politically, ideologically are poles apart, yet they are all described populist. So let me very briefly, Catherine, sort of introduce or try to define a little bit the notion of populism, which we haven't done so far. There's a great deal of literature about populism nowadays in political science. Essentially, I can see four major features. It's very mainstream typology here. First of all, we find populism entails a criticism of the forms and practices of liberal democracy. Second, populism is a movement that tends to draw its values from the past. This is what Peter Kellner was saying, and which offers an ideological and sentimental landmark to the people. Thirdly, populism offers a Manichaean worldview in which the people, understood as the popular classes, are celebrated, and the political elites are presented as corrupt or out of touch. So populism is therefore about siding with the people against the elites. And fourthly and finally, populism is largely described as demagogy and catch-all politics. So that's for the definition. I have no time really to get back to that definition. I have some problems with some elements, but let's move on. So what I could say at this stage is populism is definitely a complex notion, and therefore one has to exercise a degree of caution when using it. Let me now turn to another consideration. Populism is used very widely, as I said, but I think it is ironic to note that the threat of populism and the relative success of that notion in the social sciences, notably on the media, are inversely proportional to the presence and visibility of the people, understood, as I said, as working class or popular classes in politics. In other words, the less represented the popular classes are in political parties, in parliament, in governments, the more populism is branded a threat for democratic politics. So I think that's a very interesting point probably to reflect upon in our discussion. So populism is bad, as we know it. I think I would agree that it is something which, for all the Democrats, would like to oppose and fight back. But still, populism is very often associated with political immaturity. That's another point I'd like to make, which is essentially indicating if populism is about the working class or the popular classes, then popular immaturity means essentially that the people, notably when they vote or when they choose their representatives can't make the right choices. I have no time to elaborate on that, but if you want a case study, go back in France in the 2005 referendum on the European Treaty, where 55% of the French population rejected that text after a very long, passionate and politicized national debate. What happened immediately, most of the media, mainstream parties of the center-left and center-right immediately reprimanded the people who had voted wrongly, which had supported the demagogues of the left and of the right, and for that reason couldn't be trusted. What happened, you know it. A year later, the same text was largely rebranded and was adopted without a referendum this time. This is the Lisbon Treaty. Another problem I see, and now I'm moving to getting close to the French case, which is when you use, the notion of populism, in fact, you tend, and it's very much the case in the media, you tend to put in the same category political forces or politicians who really ideologically, politically would come at totally at loggerheads politically. They agree on nothing. Very good example of that currently in French politics is, of course, radical left with the left front, notably Mélenchon, the presidential candidate, and Le Pen. They are both described as populist by most of the media in France. And I think it's problematic because, as Michel very acutely and very nicely described, what characterizes Le Pen's politics is essentially a kind of cultural differentialism. It is very much ethnic-based politics. It's not at all what Mélenchon is about. Mélenchon is about essentially a strong, radical, robust criticism of neoliberal politics. And that's not the same. So yet they are, seen as the two flip sides of the same coin. So this is another danger with using the notion with no caution, is that you tend to send implicitly a message to the public, which is, in fact, the two extremes are symmetrical. They are the same. They converge. And I think, of course, that may be a good political point to make if you are part of the political game. But as someone studying politics, you have to be more careful. Things are more complex than that. And I'd like to finish with some reference. I'll pick on some of the aspects. And I read Michel Viviorca's pamphlet yesterday, and in his opening pages, he was also referring to the wealth of literature which has been published in France since the 1980s about the National Front, notably how to characterize the National Front. And I'm one of those thinking that the notion of populism, or to coin an expression, to use an expression coined by a French political scientist, Pierre-André Taguieff, the national populism is not a very suited definition of, not very suited notion to describe what it is. Why is that? First of all, Taguieff, when he did that in the mid-1980s, imported a notion which came from the US, and also it was a reference to a debate about the new right in the USA, how to characterize the rise of the new right at the time. And he was adamant when he wrote a seminal book study about that with the National Front in the 1980s was no longer a fascist party. It was no longer even an extreme right party. It was something else. It was national populism. Populism, but national. The party, embedded in the nation, so to speak. A party, so to speak, which had a stake in the nation. I think that's a contentious interpretation. Because as Michel reminded us of, 10 years after its creation, 1972, National Front in 1980 was you still had within the party officials which were monarchist, pro-Nazi collaborators, OAS nostalgics, OAS the white terrorist organization in Algeria, Maurassiens, and so on and so forth. So of course, to call that national populism instead of extreme right, which to me would seem the very simple, straightforward way of calling them, because that's what they are, is a way to downplay their positioning politically and what they advocate politically. It sounds less threatening. it sounds much more respectable to be called national populist as opposed to extreme right, if not fascist. So critics have argued that it helped, in fact, kickstart the long process of de-demonization. That would be the expression, instead of demonizing, it's a de-demonization of the National Front. And I think this process is not over. Some forces in France are still working very, very hard on it to de-demonize the National Front indeed. The second point is, later on, in the 1990s, another CEVIPOF colleague, Pascal Perrineau, talked about gaucho-le-penisme. That was another way of trying to put a tag and to shed some light on the meaning of the FN. What gaucho-le-penisme meant, gaucho comes from gauche, left. That is to say, an attempt to explain that in fact there was the electorate of the FN was no longer the bourgeois of the 16e arrondissement in Paris, but more and more blue-collar working class electorate. And it was all the more tempting to say that at the time the Communist Party, which had been a very important political force in France until the 1980s, had suddenly lost much of its support electorally. So from a party which still got about 11% of the vote in 1984 at the European election, suddenly was a party with hardly receiving 5% of the share of the vote. So that was another point to show. Anyway, again, same story. They are far left, far right, the same flip side of the same coin, because you see, this blue-collar working class electorate was able, very quickly to transfer their vote from the far left to the far right. So in a way, there must be some political convergence there going on. Well, I think electoral studies show different things. In fact, even if you take the best electoral result among working class voters in France, which was the latest presidential election, where Marine Le Pen got 31% of the share of the working class vote in France. And then even, I don't have time, you should elaborate what working class, because you have different subcategories within the working class. So 31%, well, that means at least 69% of the working class don't vote for Le Pen. And what's more, there's a lot of working class people who simply have ceased to vote altogether. There's a sort of a saying in France, what's the party of the working class today? Well, it's the party of abstention. Working class people abstain far more than middle class nowadays. It's a kind of a Americanization of French politics, so to speak. The popular classes vote less, only the educated and well-off vote. So that's why, again, the gaucho-le-penisme, in my view, is not totally convincing. So I shall leave it there with this is my concluding remark, is that what is missing on the debate about populism is, in fact, there's very, very little is said, from commentators or sometimes even political scientists about what are the reasons for the transfer of votes from, say, the Conservative Party to UKIP. Is it really the appeal? Is it Farage's appeal, personal appeal? I don't think so, really. I think there's more to it, and I think there's probably a negative reason for that, which is possibly people feel let down by the policies that have been implemented by the mainstream parties in power. Austerity. What does that make on people's mind, when you really suffer from those policies in economic crisis, unemployment, also the loss of class identity for the working class, or the rise of an elected technocratic government. Think of the case of Italy or Greece for a moment. Why would people feel loyal and would engage with those mainstream parties if they think they've been let down by them? So I will leave it there, and I hope I wasn't too long.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think this gives us a number of areas that some of you might want to dig into. I think one of the key things to keep in mind about populism and why it's easy to actually put a populist tag both on the left and on the right is that populism has a very tricky relationship with democracy. There is no populism without a measure of democracy, because actually the rise of populism is a measure of the betrayal of the democratic promise. That's one of the things that Mélenchon and somebody like Marine Le Pen or somebody like Farage or like UKIP, what they do very effectively is not necessarily a direct accusation toward the immigrant or toward whoever they decide to scapegoat. The accusation is that you were betrayed by the elite, and it's the role of that elite in a democratic context that is really actually focused upon in populism. It's the notion of betrayal that I think, and then that notion of betrayal possibly, you know, spawns very, very different interpretations across different countries. Just one last thing on the working class, because it's also a note of optimism. It's very important to note the transformation of the electorate for the Front National, and that's precisely what Michel does in his pamphlet. But one of the things that's quite interesting about the Front National is that it doesn't lose the rest or some of the rest of its electorate that is actually not working class, more petit bourgeois, much further down in the south of France, but also toward the east of France. In fact, those of you who know the maps know that the Front National, it's like a crescent that goes from sort of the top of France all the way to the south on the east. And actually, one of the interesting things is that the de-demonization and the respectability strategy, what it does is it forces you to cater to more and more and more varied electorates. That's one of the measures of success. But it also has built-in limits, and that's one of the things that we've already started to see with the Front National, and which somebody like Joël Gombin has actually identified quite cleverly, which is that actually now there is a real problem for the Front National. Those votes that they are getting, you know, from the working class and so on, is entailing a kind of discourse that is starting to become alienating to some of those other people who have been the bulwark of their support for quite a while, which is not working class, which is actually much more petit bourgeois and has very different class interests. So it'll be interesting to see what happens over time as they have to cater to both of these. Right, over to you. We've spoken far too much, myself included. Yes, I've got three gentlemen here. I'll start with you, and you, and you. Thanks.
Very interesting paper. I just wanted to share together the historical with the present day. And, you know, this idea of alliances, if you go back and look at historical fascism, the great struggle for the historical fascists to make a breakthrough to get state power was in Italy between late 20 and early 22 to win over fascists to win over conservatives, one sort of another. And Hitler, after 28, wins over the old German nationalist Protestant bulwark, even if they're working class. Those are the things that, you know, make them contending parties. If we switch to the present, then of course the equation is conservatives and populists. And populists, I mean, whatever you want to call these people, this is the question. The populists are not, you know, are not fascists. Fascists believe in creating an elite society, right? And you know, they want to have an elite militarized society. They don't want democracy. Democracy is a cancer for the rhetoric of traditional fascism. And so I think, you know, you get yourself tied up into knots. And I do think to some extent, I mean, Andrea Mammoni's work on this is interesting because what he shows is that this culture card, which starts in France in the 1980s, should be taken with some grain of salt, at least for long periods of time. It's a way of trying to be polite and not saying what you really mean. And eventually some people believe their own rhetoric. Feeney does, for instance. But the interesting point here, getting to UKIP, I noticed when people interviewed some of the UKIP voters in Essex, they seem to have got it from a pamphlet or a pep talk, because they all said the same thing. It's space, not race. So, you know, they got this into their head already. But I'm sure the same people say it's space, not race, when they're mumbling, oh yeah, actually it is race, but I can't say that anymore. Just like in the United States, you know, with Obama, the reason you oppose Obama because he was born in Kenya, not that he was born in Alabama, right? This is the big difference. So it's a difficult one because some people actually start believing the rhetoric and do change. I mean, Feeney certainly did change over a long period of time. So I have just two questions. The question I will have is, what about the mobilization against gay marriage in France, which I thought was a quite interesting phenomenon, and to what extent, we haven't talked about the church, to what extent those parts of the church which are still, you know, caught in a time warp, because again, classical fascism, the problem in Europe was, of course, there were large minorities or majorities in the Protestant and Catholic churches of interwar Europe, who are against democracy. You know, you have the idea of clerical fascism. I'm just wondering what this phenomenon has for the French case. And the Italian case, one final point, in a way, if you look at the final results in the elections now, in a way, the right, as we understand, has kind of been lost in the shuffle in a curious way, because Grillo is this weird mixture. He's certainly not right. His base is left, and the people started voting for him in the last election are all Lega Nord people who come over. So it's a very odd phenomenon. It's very difficult to disaggregate.
Thank you. Yes. I'm going to take some questions together if that's all right. So,
just a very simple question about the personality, but I've made a repeat actually the role personality plays in the rise of these populists. And populists have been rising across Europe, and it's been some extraordinary rises. But if you look at the Netherlands, one interesting example, the left-wing socialists had a huge rise in the polls before the election, and then their leader Neil Rona put in an absolutely terrible performance in a debate, and their support collapsed straight away. But I wonder if UKIP lost Nigel Farage and had to replace him with somebody like Pearson again, would they have the same kind of debate?
Thank you. I'll take this final one.
Yes, there was a general question, very short one. Looking across sort of recent experience, what is the experience of the popular parties in what I might call sort of the day-to-day grind of administration in power when they are in local government, local authorities, let's call it the boring committee work, budgets, all of the sort of the grind of administration. What's the experience of these individuals who may or may not be as committed to this compared to this kind of their ethical views?
Great, thank you very much. So we've got a question here in part about codes. Are they actually all speaking in codes? This whole idea that it's about culture, space, not race, and so on. It's an evolution of the rhetoric, but actually, the kernel of it hasn't actually evolved. I mean, that's a valid question to pose. The role of personalities, and then of course, how well do they do if you elect them? Because there is, the quip is often to say, well, let's elect them. They self-destruct the minute they're elected to anything, and this might be the best way to get rid of them. Certainly, the BNP would tend to suggest that that's a very good test. So who wants to start on this? Peter, you had a question directly addressed to you, so I'll start with you.
Personally, I think my answer is, it's a good question. My instinctive answer is that personality can get you noticed and get you initial converts. And it is not just about extremism. Think of Craig Mania following the first TV debate 3 years ago. But it's a bit it's about like advertising a new product. You might a smart ad might you try it once, but if you're going to come back and buy it again, it needs something more. So I think we need something more. So if Farage was to disappear, yes, I think UKIP would suffer. But I suspect UKIP's terminus will be almost independent of whether it's Farage or not. It will affect the trajectory, but not the end position. But as the data, you're absolutely right about the BNP. Because UKIP, one of the things at the European Parliament, it's a completely ludicrous body, because having all these elections which cause all this turbulence, and the Parliament does bugger all. So what happens is the BNP and UKIP members of the European Parliament do bugger all there. They don't they only turn up to sort of shout and yell abuse and then go away again. There isn't actually any day-to-day administrative tasks for them to do. It'd be interesting to see whether the UKIP councillors in those councils where there's where there's 6 or 8 or 10 of them, how they behave, because it may be that they will self-destruct. I'm not quite as hopeful as that as with the BNP, because I suspect the proportion of complete UKIP idiots is probably smaller than the proportion of BNP idiots, but I'm sure there will be some.
And I'd like to just address the same question to Offline, because it's quite interesting. Obviously, Golden Dawn have representation in the Parliament. They behave very particularly. I've seen them do it in a sense. And then also to Michel in terms of Marine Le Pen, because here was a change of leadership and a change of it. Offline and then Michel.
Yeah, there's definitely in the Golden Dawn there is a parliamentary phase and an extra parliamentary phase. and the parliamentary phase is the one that actually wants to be in the parliament and engage with the discussion, but also by discrediting the parliament and by being insulting and by not having any political correctness whatsoever. And then there is the extra parliamentary, which is the violent phase, which is the openly violent and doesn't respect and attacks immigrants wherever they can, but also the humanitarian assistance phase, which has to do with helping out. Now, one point that I would like to raise has to do with the notion of public space and how that relates to these kinds of extreme formation, because this I find particularly interesting, because there are actually designated areas that become not just symbolic eventually, but also they are very important in how they operate. Because we did talk about this peri-urban kind of electorate of Le Front National, but also in the Greek case, you've got no-go areas actually, not just for those who live there and they feel that they are insecure, and this is where the Golden Dawn goes and protects, but also for the immigrants themselves, in that they know that they shouldn't go to particular places because there they may be attacked. And that actually gives a big significance to how the local authorities address these questions. And one reason why I said that the mayor of Athens actually became so significant in his fight with the Golden Gun in Constitution Square, it was exactly because there was a public space that wanted to be used by an extreme party. And that the space actually gets such a big significance in terms of how you address this phenomenon of extremism.
Yes, absolutely. Michel, I mean, Front National, change of leadership,
Well,
how much does it matter?
no, it is clear that passing from the father to the daughter has changed a lot, but it is not only a question of person. It is a question of internal equilibrium within the party. Because when Marine Le Pen was elected the president, she had to fight against Bruno Gollnisch, who was, let us say, on the side of the father. So it was a question of political equilibrium in the party. So that's my first point. My second point is that, and it has always been like that, the Front National does not like to be accused of covering or organizing any violence, any practical things against migrants and so on. There was a big affair in France, I am not sure, but I think it was in 1990, something like that, in the city of Carpentras, not far from the place where I spent my holidays, because there is a Jewish cemetery here in this city, and some graves were destroyed, but not only this, a corpse was taken out of the grave, and the awful things were done to the corpse. And so it was a huge scandal. And everybody in the political system said, this is the National Front. And maybe 6 or 8 years after, it was clear that it was not the National Front. It was some extreme right people. So there is always accusations. And also it is true that the National Front sometimes need rather violent people, for instance, in order to secure its organization when they organize a big manifestation. So that's the first point. I would like to say a certain number of, you were absolutely right when you were quoting Mitterrand deciding to propose the so-called proportionnel. That is to say, you have to let the National Front get in the parliament. And it is always a shame from my point of view, but it's a moral point of view and not a political point of view. It's a shame when I see that in order to divide the right, you introduce this kind of vote. So you are absolutely right. Let me just say that today it has been again promised by François Hollande, but it is because it is not only the National Front that would like to get in. It could be other political groups, other parties that would like to have more seats. So now what I would like to say about the gay anti-gay marriage protest. The National Front, of course, the members and the voters of the National Front, not all of them, but many of them are on this side. But Marine Le Pen did not appear as giving the Front National an important visibility in all these protests. And she was right from her point of view. Because, first of all, a certain number of people that vote for her or for her party are in favor of this marriage. And it's when you say Catholic people, for instance, I have read a survey that said that 1/3 of Catholic people, of people that say that they are Catholic, are in favor of this kind of way. So it's not so clear. And it were hardliner people that were among the Catholic. It was some extreme group of Catholic. So it's a complex story, but the more important is that the National Front was much more on this side than on the other side, but not as such, not very visible. Then, yes.
Okay.
So sorry.
Here. Thank you very much. I know you have to go.
Okay,
Thank you.
okay, great to meet you. I will be very, very brief now. A very last point, very general point. We are living a big crisis, which is an economic crisis and a political crisis in all these European countries. Then in this crisis, we see different kinds of phenomena. If you go to Italy, for instance, you have Grillo. It's not right, it's not left, it's a mixture, and so it's one kind of expression of this political crisis, of this political system. In other countries, you had the idea that the right should leave the place to the left, or the contrary, and if it does not work, we should have technical governments, and nothing else. In other countries, like France, you have national populism, if I can use this expression, I mean, National Front, and Mélenchon, other expressions of this crisis. And in some countries like Spain, it's very interesting, you have indignados. It's under the level of politics. Mm-hmm. So I think that I go too quickly, but you have different solutions or expressions of this political crisis, and it depends on the history of the country and on the political culture.
Okay, Nano, because then two more questions, and then
Okay,
we'll
I'll
all
be
have a chance
very
to conclude.
brief. The point about personality politics. I think, yeah, when you're a small party, it matters, clearly. If we take the two leaders of parties in Europe movements, which I think, to me, conform the best to my typology of what is populism, Farage and Grillo in Italy. I think what's the difference between them and the rest of their national political class? I think they polarize. They polarize. Something the other leaders in Britain or Italy don't do or don't do anymore. So I think to polarize the political game, I think, seems to be a plus, if you like. Because not only you seem, through various means to indicate that, the opponents have failed politically, but also you engage with a number of issues in a way where you offer options. And I think what is probably politics in Europe and in the world possibly suffers from, in my view, is that there's a lack of polarization. People call that some sort of conviction politics. There is a left, there is a right. And between them, there's a difference. And part of the problem, I think, nowadays is that the differences now are so thin, particularly on economic matters between the center-left and the center-right, that's part of the problem. So when someone who looks like a credible leader, of course, if you go on there and start, shouting abuse at your opponent or have sort of an abusive racial, to be racially or abusive, of course that won't work. That was a bit of a problem with Le Pen's father. With Marine it's easier because she doesn't do that, but she polarizes, so that's why it works. That's why it works with Farage and also Grillo. The gay marriage in France, I think what is remarkable in that case is that for the first time in a long time, all the streams of the French right, from the far right, the extreme right, the fascist right, to the parliamentary right, have got together around, and they rallied around this issue of anti-gay marriage. And for me, what does that mean? I think it's in the continuation of the point I've just made, which is the debate in France, like in most European countries, is no longer about left and right on differences of the left and right about economic issues. So more and more, and that's a shift in my view, again, another sign of Americanization of French politics, toward what the Americans call culture wars. And that's an example of the culture wars. To be for or against gay marriage, that's really a culture war. To be for or against abortion. to be for, against, whatever. You know, this sort of societal issues, not only the economy that the socialists and the UMP disagree. It's about that. So I think that opens the door to what Michel alluded to in the thing, is that possibly the bridge between the right wing of the UMP with the FN. There's a group of UMP MPs called the Droite Populaire, Popular Right. They're mostly elected in the south of France. And this group, let's look at them, let's monitor them, because they're very close. They're getting dangerously close to proposing alliances locally with the FN. The last point about this is a slight disagreement with Peter Kellner and Michel on the PR, and Mitterrand with PR allowed the FN to get a platform it wouldn't have had otherwise. Possibly they got elected, but since 1988 there hasn't been any PR in France. Still the FN is there. Whatever the election, they still get 10% plus of the vote. They get people elected at local, regional, national level. Of course, they don't have any MP, where they've got 2 or 3 at the moment, but it doesn't solve the political problem. The FN is still there, you know. So I don't think PR or first or past the post ballot or whatever electoral system plays a part. I think the problem is political. The problem is about the lack of representation of certain ideas in French political, in French mainstream politics, and which and as long as it lasts, of course, that benefits the FN, which of course can cultivate its traditional demagogy and appeal to the sort of disenfranchised voters.
Thank you. I'm going to take your 2 questions, and then hopefully they can. I'm sorry. You can catch our speakers as they leave. I'm going to take your 2 last questions, and then we're going to wrap up with some conclusions.
Just a quick question about the crossover between Euroscepticism and racism and xenophobia. It's interesting how the Front National has gone in one direction, which is from a xenophobic agenda, anti-immigrant agenda, to a Eurosceptic one, whereas of course UKIP has moved in the other direction, where they've recently discovered anti-immigrant sentiment as a good way of winning votes. So I'm just wondering, how much is this a grab bag of protest and anti-elite issues that are just kind of put together randomly, or how might this actually become articulated into a relationship that that they can use? For example, one of the arguments I've heard some of the more xenophobic MEPs use in Brussels is, well, it's all the EU's fault that there is all of these immigrants coming in. You know, basically blame the EU for migration policy. But likewise, you can also have, yes, and the immigrants, of course, they get more from Europe than we do, which is, I mean, how they get this, I don't know. But this is very important. It's very important to understand this relationship between those 2 issues better, because contrary to what Peter Kellner said, the European Parliament actually has a lot of powers now. The Lisbon Treaty has meant that now the European Parliament, as of next year, if it's full of demagogues and xenophobes, will actually be able to block key bits of legislation and indeed attack policies on, for example, anti-discrimination and racism. So this could really matter. This isn't just a matter of how do they win their votes, it's a matter of what will they do when they get into the Parliament.
My question is relatively similar. It was going to be a question for Peter. Given that he's left, I'm turning it into a little bit of a comment, perhaps, which is to say, similarly to Heather, my question is that I don't think the European Parliament does bugger all. My question is, to what extent has UKIP's rise been legitimised on the back of successive European Parliament victories, as it were, on a national level, rising up the ranks, establishing themselves in the national landscape, precisely because the mainstream parties in this country did think that European Parliament elections were really not important at all. And if you just look at the kind of the material that was sent to the electorate, again, going back to the pamphlet, UKIP was very, very good at covering that angle. None of the mainstream parties did so very much. So at that point, it seemed to be that they were banking on an sort of barging into an area where they didn't have so much competition. And I wonder to what extent possibly the mainstream parties do need to change tack in order to fill that gap now, because they do realise to an extent that UKIP needs to be fought not only nationally but also at a European level.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask you each to incorporate any answers, but also to conclude. So I'm going to start with you.
Okay, thank you. Let me go back to my initial comment in that I have a difficulty in understanding what is mainstream nowadays and what is not, because I do see party systems in most countries actually, and especially in the countries of the South, as being a very fluid kind of picture there, and especially their voters that can move from the left to extreme right-wing parties. So it is a very fluid environment that has to do with the fact that there is austerity. And that for me is a very clear connection there. Because yes, there may be extreme right families that exist there traditionally, but at the end of the day, when do they gain? They gain when there are periods of crisis, where there is unemployment, when the policies of austerity actually people get tired with them. So that for me is very important. And then the problem that I have with the notion of populism is that then you don't get the different qualifications and the differences between the parties, because with the populists you just put different ideological families, different groups, different parties actually in one same group, and you don't get to understand what exactly is happening in there. But what I think is that the whole environment is so fluid that it does allow, from any perspective, any point of view, actually this rise of populism, left, right, or whatever. I would like to connect what Heather Gregg and make a point there, because there is the Euroscepticism, which is very important. And of course, the European Parliament is particularly significant in how it addresses the issue. But there is a Euroscepticism of a constructive type as well. I don't think that we should make black and white images that there is populism, Euroscepticism, and anti-democracy, and then on the other hand there is democracy and Europhile or whatever. There is Euroscepticism in every one of us at the moment. And some of us that we are Europhiles actually, we have a big difficulty in defending the European Union at the moment. And let me finish with just one point. There are institutional responses to the phenomenon of populism and extremism, and indeed there has also been a recent report from a parliamentarian, I cannot remember his name, that spoke about the solution in an institutional way, how to address it, how to actually deal with an extreme or a populist party in engaging or in completely overruling or whatever. The problem is that you need to deal with it also in an economic way. If you just, it's as simple as this. If you don't create working opportunities for people who are out of jobs at the moment, you are just creating an environment for extremism to develop. And this is actually a lesson, and I think something that Germany, which is the most powerful country at the moment in Europe, should try and address. It's not only through the banking union that you solve the problem. You just have to realize that there is a Eurosceptic phenomenon there. There is a lot of reaction happening from all sorts of expressions and directions, and you need to address it also in an economic way. You just need to do something about a growing Europe.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Philippe, and then I'm going to conclude with you.
Yes, I agree, although the EU sets out, of course, a number of constraining rules about immigration, and when you're a member state, you have to abide by them. I think at the moment it is clear that, to put the blame on the EU about issues of immigration is a bit, wide of the mark, because clearly all political parties react to it. It has become football, where all parties left, even of the left or the centre left, have positioned themselves with regard to that. So in fact, you could even say, why is there now all those themes of to be anti-EU, immigration, too many foreigners, and so on and so forth? You realize that mainstream parties over the past 20, 30 years, that's the case of France, have positioned themselves with respect to those issues. So in fact, they have given some credit to these issues. So it's not the economics which seem to matter for them, but it's really immigration. So in a way, they have justified Le Pen, and they've led people to believe that in fact maybe the Front National was tackling the problem in the right manner. So you see that there's also good responsibility on the part of the main parties. Beppe Grillo, very briefly, I think it's a fascinating case study. Everyone, if there's anyone here about to start a PhD research on in politics, I think that you should really do that, because I agree with you. This is a remarkable case of political volatility. It's when you read his program, it's fascinating. There are bits which could be placed on the left, others on the right, even some on the far left, or on the far right. This is really a mishmash of, bit of a, and that's very unusual. Compare that with for instance, all the forces, notably put on the left, the Linke, the Left Front, it's not that. They really stick to a very left-wing agenda. So that's why, again, I find it hard to say they're all part of the same category or family. The last point of that is to conclude and say I read a very thought-provoking, interesting article on the LSE blog run by Professor Patrick Dunleavy yesterday. Unfortunately, I forgot, but you'll find it. The name of the author, it's an Oxford Don, who was trying to give an interpretation of the meaning of the UKIP vote at the last local election. And he says, well, it's not Europe. It's not even about immigration. It's about the crisis, and it's about jobs. People feel let down. That's the point I was making earlier. So in a way, it's a reaction against the system, the establishment, the main party, which over the years have proven unsuccessful at tackling those measures. So it's a protest vote. If you can't give us a better future to us or to our children, then we'll take our revenge. We'll vote for those who clearly are against you, and possibly they'll do better than you.
Michel, you have the last word.
Well, it will be a very, very short last word. The Parliament, first of all. Yes, the next elections will, I think, bring a lot of new people from the extreme to the Parliament. But then you don't know what will happen. Le Pen's father was European member of the Parliament. He never went, or almost never went to Brussels. So maybe they will not.
Marine's the same. She's an MP.
Yeah. So maybe they will not come. Maybe they will come. And if they come, you don't know what will happen. Will they make coalitions with all together and be a kind of anti-everything force? This is not sure. I remember discussing with Tom Bendit, explaining me that he used to discuss a lot with Martinez, who is a National Front, he was. And he could discuss. I mean, so being in Brussels in this kind of arena also, you are part of a group. I mean, and you are part of the arena, and things may also change. I don't imagine that they would change their way of thinking totally, but it's not so clear. I remember the extreme left Trotskyist people in Brussels, discussing with some of them. They did not vote in Brussels as they should have voted. So, life, you don't know. I think it's a big problem, a big risk, and so on, but I would not say that I'm sure that this or that could happen. And I was asked before, we were asked before, is there some experience of leading a city in France in the mid-90s? 3 big cities were politically given to the National Front. The first one, Toulon, a very big city. It has been a disaster for the city and for the people and for this party. And it is finished. The second one, Vitrolles, it did not work also. So the only one is Orange, where Bompard, you never know if he's really National Front or classical right, but on the very extreme dimension of the classical. So it's not so, because when you have to be the master of a city, you can have difficulties to follow your program. You don't have the people that are able to do it. And so I remember one of my students who wanted to make a PhD on Toulon, because Toulon was becoming national. So he told me, I'm going to live in a popular neighborhood to see how awful it is to be in a popular neighborhood, a migrant, when the National Front rules the city. And after 1 year, she came back and said, no, it's not a problem. Because the problem of these people is not at all the National Front. The problem of these people is social issues. They don't have jobs and so, and the police, but it has always been the police. So you don't, just to say, you don't know what could happen when these people could pass from a protest and anti-systemic position to a political power position. We don't know. I mean, but I hope we don't have to know.
Thank you very much. I think that this discussion, for me, in part, reinforces the idea that much of this needs to be interpreted in context. You know, when we talk about how much the recession affects or doesn't affect. Yes, to Greece, the Front National, you know, predates this. When you see, you know, how well, in fact, some of these right-wing populist parties are doing in Norway, this is not about jobs, right? So I think that, that again, it really reinforces the idea that while there is a generic expression in some ways of a lot of some of the resentments, there are also very, very nationally specific, culturally specific, socially specific springs, which is exactly what we're trying to look at with the reluctant radicals. I'd like to thank my speakers, including the absent one, and I'd also like to thank the European Institute here at UCL. Thank you very much for hosting us, and also the Open Society Foundations for supporting this project so generously. And thank you for coming. Thanks a lot.